Crime rates are out of control across the entire state thanks to Democrat policies that punish gun owners and embolden criminals. New York State Firearms Association is leading the fight for stand your ground law here in Albany, guys. Watch the video with State Senator George Borrello and then join the fight today. Good morning, guys. Aaron Dorr here at the New York State Firearms Association, joined today with pro-gun champion and State Senator George Borrello, who is leading the fight, wait for it, for stand your ground law here in New York State. Good morning, George. Thank you for your time today.
Hey, it's good to be with you again, Aaron. Thank you.
So, 40 states almost 40 states have some form of stand your ground law. Of course, we in New York State do not have that. You're trying to fix that right now in Albany with a major bill that's being heard in committee just in the last couple of days, Senate 1120. What does your bill do? How to benefit New Yorkers?
Well, first and foremost, this bill allows that if you are lawfully present somewhere, it doesn't need to be just inside your home. If you're lawfully present somewhere and you have to defend yourself, whether it's with a firearm or otherwise, that you will not face criminal and civil prosecution as long as it's justified. And that's really a key point. It has to be justified. It has to be an immediate, imminent threat to your life or your loved ones. And right now in New York, we have a duty to retreat, which means if you're being attacked, even if you've been shot, you have a duty to not defend yourself, but to retreat from that situation, even if retreat isn't even an option. We've seen, unfortunately, in New York State, examples of what happens when someone tries to defend themselves, especially with our far left socialist George Soros DAs like Alvin Bragg in New York City. And that is why this bill is so critically important.
So I'm going to ask you about Alvin Bragg here in a little bit. First, I want to kind of break down the bill just a little bit. And for those who are watching, this is a map right now taken from Wikipedia 5 minutes ago of the states in America that have some form of stand your ground law on the books today. In some cases, it was passed legislation. In some cases, it's law via court precedent. In some cases, George, it is a jury instructions. But we're one of only a handful of states in the entire country does not have these protections. And as you said, because of that, if a New Yorker is forced to use appropriate defensive force and it complies with all of our current laws, they could still be criminally charged because it did not retreat an arbitrary number of steps first. And it kind of depends on what county you're in, but these days, more and more, it's a very real risk for gun owners. So your bill, first and foremost, it first removes that requirement to retreat from the code, correct?
That's correct. You no longer have to retreat. You have the right to, again, stand your ground. And that's key because in something like this, a crisis situation, you don't have but a split second to make that decision. And I think that's when people have to understand that the law is on their side and that their Second Amendment right is being protected. And also just the basic right to defend yourself. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be with a firearm.
Right. Now, you mentioned also in the bill, I read it myself again here a little bit ago, that it covers the threatened use of force. And the reality is that a large number of self-defense situations end with no shots fired. The mere display of a firearm or any kind of a weapon from the would-be victim, in many cases, chases away the would-be attacker. But right now in New York, if you draw your firearm, you could be charged with brandishing or some sort of an assault charge. And the goal for any gun owner is de-escalation. We want that case to end with no gunshots fired. And New York right now does not protect us in that situation. Your bill addresses that as well, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Keep in mind, and I know people that someone very close to me actually who, did not use their weapon in a threatening manner, simply, displayed that they were armed. And that brought on, basically, without ever being convicted of a crime, having all of their guns seized and a year-long legal battle to get those guns back.
Yeah, again, we should be absolutely, as a state, encouraging that de-escalation. But right now, you're facing charges merely for stopping the attack before it actually began. That's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, in committee last week on this, George, there was a lot of talk about your provision that grants immunity language. And of course, immunity was held up as some kind of a big threat because you're going to somehow legalize all shootings. But your bill does not do that. The point is that if you are in compliance with existing use of force laws and you use justifiable force, and as you mentioned, in a place that you're lawfully permitted to be, you should not be able to be charged with a crime in the first place. Am I reading that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And this is an important point because they feel this is somehow going to justify random acts of violence. And the reality is, in New York State, we already have a lot of random acts of
they're
violence.
already taking place.
Yeah, this is about protecting people, and being allowed to protect themselves from those random acts of violence that take place every day in New York State.
And so, yeah, if the force you used meets the current use of force guidelines, then you'd be immune from prosecution. And in an era when we do have Alvin Bragg style prosecutors in the state, we do have radical leftists taking up the DA's office, not just in Manhattan, but in a growing number of communities, has never been more important. Otherwise, you're going to spend a year and a half of your life or 2 years of your life, and only heaven knows how much money in court fees just to try to prove your innocence after the fact. And in many cases, for many New Yorkers, we simply can't take that hit. And what happens a lot of times is people will plead out to a lesser charge and go to prison because they can't afford to go head to head with the state.
Well, and the irony of all this is if you look at the justifications for the disastrous bail reform laws in New York State, all the criminal justice reforms that have spiked crime, the far left is all about the fact that, people, will sometimes plead out, rather than go through the process. And
Right.
That's the justification for these laws that let criminals run the streets and revolving door justice. But for someone who hasn't committed a crime, someone who is in fact trying to prevent themselves from being a victim, those same rules don't apply in their twisted world.
No, not at all. You also mentioned civil immunity. It's a really important part of this. The idea that someone attacks you or your loved ones on the street, you're forced to defend yourself or your family from that criminal, and that same criminal can then drag you into civil court to bankrupt you is preposterous. The old phrase about civil court is even if you win, you lose, because you've spent a fortune to stop that attack against you. Your bill would cover that as well, where if the actions were justifiable, that you could not be sued civilly. Is that right?
Well, yeah, and again, that's another great point. Even if you get to the point like you did with with the instances that we saw in New York City, where finally, because of the outcry of the public, the criminal charges were dropped, you still face the possibility of a civil lawsuit, and once again, very, very costly. And in the end, you may have to, even though you were, not found guilty in a court of law for criminal purposes, you may still end up paying a lot of money just to essentially stop the pain of that lawsuit. And that's just so wrong and so unjust.
Yeah, absolutely. Another huge part of your bill, I think, is that maybe is not being talked about as much is the pretrial immunity hearing. And a lot of states have stand your ground law right now. And even right now, they're trying to upgrade, you might say, their current laws, because in a state with stand your ground law where there is no clarity on how you can invoke it, a lot of times it comes down to the courts to decide when and how you can use those protections. And in many cases, it only becomes usable after a conviction on your appeal. And your language here is very clear. You can go before a judge with your counsel before trial begins, both criminally and or civilly, and assert your protections under this bill in advance. And if the judge agrees, you walk and you're spared from years of agony. That's a very important aspect. Otherwise, you might end up winning the court case on appeal, but your life is already over at that point in many cases.
Well, exactly, and this is another very important part of this law, and there's no doubt about it that this can ruin your life, even though you may in the end ultimately be found innocent. But this gives that judge the opportunity, and it certainly it strengthens the ability for that judge to be able to find to find in favor of this person who's been wrongfully accused.
Yeah, in some areas you may not choose to do that because you might think you're better off going through the process, but giving gun owners the option with their counsel to do that, it depends on what county they're in, unfortunately, would be a huge benefit to law-abiding gun owners. The hearing you had on this bill last week was quite something. I have to admit, no public was allowed to testify on behalf of the bill. That was very unfortunate. But we heard the same drivel that we so often hear in other states that are trying to advance this legislation. The big one right off the bat is that stand your ground law. And frankly, the insinuation was that you personally, by extension, somehow you're racist, or this legislation is racist because of how it's going to be used. That was absolutely absurd. It's an old, worn out line. What's your response to that?
Well, as I said to my colleagues, you have a much greater chance, of being shot or attacked by someone in the city you live in, because they were all from New York City,
right?
By a criminal, and probably a career criminal, who's illegally in possession of a weapon. That's the greatest threat to you, first and foremost.
Yep.
I also said this whole idea that this is somehow racist is also patently ridiculous. Unfortunately, in New York City, people of color are disproportionately victims of crime.
Yep.
And those people have a right to defend themselves. The two instances that we have in New York City were both people of color that were attacked.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line. This is not about racism, but this is an easy, dog whistle thing to say, racism.
Right.
And it also gets the liberals all, that's their dog whistle to stand up and forget about common sense and right and wrong and who the true victims are.
Of course, and it's their policies that have enabled all of this to happen in the first place. We have the worst gun laws in America. We're going through court nonstop trying to undo last year's damage right now. We have very limited gun rights to begin with, crappy bail reform, end quote, laws that empower and embolden these criminals, and they still then dare to claim that when people like you try to fix some of this with these legislation pieces, that somehow it's our fault, it's your fault, and you're going to make New Yorkers less safe. It had to be enraging just to hear that. And of course, the other big argument is the sky's going to fall. Yeah, if you pass this legislation, you're going to see otherwise law-abiding New Yorkers are suddenly going to become bloodthirsty, and they're going to be having duels on Main Street and looking for occasions to get involved in shootings. But again, that hasn't happened in 38 other states that already have this law on the books, has it?
Well, I haven't had a chance to fact check it, but one of my colleagues said, well, homicides are up 10% places that have, stand your ground laws. I don't think that's patently ridiculous. First and foremost, New York State is already one of the bloodiest places to begin with.
Yeah.
So, I don't see how that's the case in other states that have stand your ground laws. I would challenge that statistic. But again, this is not about the facts. This is about taking a political stance on something that really shouldn't be political, because this is not a red or blue state issue.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of times they'll hold up states like Missouri, for example, as an example of the impact of these laws. But of course, Missouri, like New York, has major blue cities run by Democrats. And so in Missouri, as an example, their crime wave is the result primarily of the policies of places like St. Louis and Kansas City, similar to New York City, Rochester, and Buffalo, blue cities run by very bad policies that end in very massive crime spikes. It's unfortunate for those who actually live in these areas. Yeah, I guess in closing, George, this is, as you've said multiple times now, this is not just theory. This impacts real people in their everyday life. You mentioned Jose Alba. And for those who don't know, here is a guy in a bodega who was attacked by a young man who was like a third of his age, who was trying to pummel him behind the counter. Alba draws a knife and ends up stabbing this guy, and Alvin Bragg throws him in prison, tosses away the key, and only after media outlets began to report on what an outrage this was he freed from that. But this guy, Jose Alba, is so concerned now about living in New York City, both because of Alvin Bragg's policies and the crime. He left America to go to a safer place, he said.
Yeah, and that's really tragic to think about the fact that he went back to, I believe, the Dominican Republic.
Yes.
And anybody who has been to the Dominican Republic, it's one of those places where they tell you, don't leave the resort.
Yeah.
It's not safe. But somehow for Jose Alba, it was safer to go back there than to continue to live in the United States of America. And that's a sad, really sad commentary about where
Absolutely.
we are from a public safety standpoint.
We had a separate case just in the last couple of weeks in Manhattan where a parking lot attendant doing his job saw a thief trying to break into cars. He goes to confront him. The thief would-be thief, whatever, draws a gun. There's a tussle. The good guy gets shot, disarms the guy, and shoots the thug back to save his life. Also faced criminal charges by Alvin Bragg until the media outcry got so loud he was forced to release him. This is not just a theoretical bill. Your bill here has massive ramifications in the lives of everyday gun owners, and these cases should not come up in the news. And the sad fact, George, is that we hear about these two cases because they make the news. How many other gun owners who are being wrongfully prosecuted, whether it's in New York City or across the state, are facing charges because of the lack of stand your ground law?
Well, and this is a really important point because, if you look at this right now, what do you want in New York? What does the far left want? The Democrats, that the one party rule that controls the state, what do they want? They want to disarm citizens while they are simultaneously allowing career criminals to be released back onto the streets over and over again. This is about disarming the citizens. This is about creating more victims, and the lack of a stand your ground law, especially when nearly 40 other states have it, is another example of how they want to continue this criminal coddling far left dystopia that we have here in New York State.
It's disgusting stuff. The bill number is S01120. We have a dueling bill in the Assembly. George, thank you so much for your time on this and for leading the fight for stand your ground law. Guys, hit the link below. Sign your petition. Tell your lawmakers in Albany to co-sponsor these bills and join the fight today.